Why does silence bother us so much? Why is the simple absence of a response capable of triggering an almost physical discomfort, an unease difficult to explain, as if something were about to go wrong? Think about it for a second. You send a message. The person sees it. Time passes. No response. In a few moments, your mind is no longer in the present. It races. It creates stories. It anticipates rejection, conflict, danger. And all this, without any real information. Have you ever experienced this? This feeling doesn't appear out of nowhere. It settles in slowly, almost invisibly, like background noise that grows until it fills everything. The heart races a little faster. The body goes on alert. The mind begins to fill the void with hypotheses that are rarely neutral. Not responding has become a sign of trouble. Silence has become a threat. And the most curious thing is that often there is absolutely nothing wrong. Even so, the brain insists on acting as if there were. What you may never have stopped to think about is that the human brain doesn't cope well with not knowing. The absence of information isn't interpreted as a blank space, but as dangerous territory. When data is lacking, the brain doesn't wait patiently. It acts. It creates meaning. And almost always, it creates the worst possible scenario. What you're about to discover may surprise you. Imagine what it would be like to live in a world where silence never meant risk. Where the lack of signals was simply a lack of signals. For the brain, this was never an option. Throughout evolution, the absence of noise, movement, or responses could mean a predator lurking, a hidden threat, something about to attack. Hearing nothing was often more dangerous than hearing something bad. The brain learned this too early, and it learned it too well. That's why, even today in a modern, safe, and digital environment, this primitive logic continues to operate behind the scenes of your mind. A boss who calls you in for a later chat without explaining why. A medical exam whose results are taking a long time to come back. An invitation that goes unanswered. The brain goes into alert mode not because it's certain of the danger, but precisely because it's not certain of anything. Uncertainty is the trigger. Stay with me until the end because understanding this mechanism completely changes how you perceive anxiety, fear, and even many thoughts that seem to arise out of nowhere. The brain isn't pessimistic by chance. It's preventative. It prefers to err on the side of caution rather than omission. Creating an imaginary threat has always seemed safer than ignoring a real danger. Even when the danger is just silence on the other side of the screen. There is something profoundly unsettling about an information vacuum. It opens the door to interpretations, and the brain hates empty spaces. Where there is no data, it invents. Where there are no answers, it constructs narratives. And these narratives are rarely gentle. They pull up memories, past experiences, old fears. Everything mixes together in seconds. You feel before you even think. You react before you even understand. This type of phenomenon, strange, invisible, and yet so human, is at the heart of what we explore here within the philosophical framework of dark human science. Understanding how deep brain mechanisms shape emotions, decisions, and perceptions without us realizing it. It's not about weakness. It's about how things work. As you watch, you might begin to recognize patterns. You might realize that many of your worries didn't stem from facts, but from gaps. From silences. From information that never arrived. And the question that remains is, if the brain creates danger when it doesn't know, what happens when we learn to see this process in action? That's exactly where the story starts to get even more interesting. And perhaps as all of this starts to make sense inside you, you'll realize you're not alone in this experience. This discomfort in the face of silence, this strange feeling of alertness when information is lacking, is neither individual nor rare. It appears in different forms at different times, but it affects practically everyone. And that's exactly why it's worth sharing this here. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment about what has touched you the most so far. It could be a specific situation, a feeling difficult to explain, or even that time when silence spoke louder than any words. Sometimes putting it out there already changes the way we perceive our own thoughts. When you comment, you're not just responding to a video. You're creating a space for exchange. Other people read it, recognize themselves in it, and realize that what seems strange or isolated also happens to them. This kind of conversation transforms the content into something alive, something that continues beyond the screen. And if, in some way, this helped you better understand what's going on in your mind, liking the video is a simple but powerful way to show that this kind of reflection matters, that this kind of content deserves to continue existing and reaching more people. And if you feel you want to continue exploring these strange phenomena of the human brain, these invisible mechanisms that shape emotions, fears, and decisions without asking permission, subscribing to the channel is almost a gesture of continuity. It's like saying, "This makes sense to me, I want to go deeper." Your participation here is what makes this space grow, gain strength, and bring this type of conversation to people who may be experiencing exactly this discomfort right now without understanding why. Stay with me because from here on out we're going to delve even deeper into this mechanism, understanding how the brain constructs these invisible threats, why it insists on filling the void with danger, and what happens when you learn to perceive this process happening in real time. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because the central point here isn't fear itself, nor bad news, nor the negative outcome that we try so hard to avoid. The real discomfort lies before that. It's born in that strange space between a question and the lack of an answer. In the silent interval where nothing has been said, nothing has been explained, nothing has been confirmed. It is there that the brain begins to work more intensely, more creatively, and, at the same time, more imprecisely. There's something almost paradoxical in all of this. The human brain deals better with a negative response than with absolute silence. Receiving a no, a difficult diagnosis, or even direct criticism usually hurts, but this pain is delimited. It has form, a beginning, a middle, and an end. Silence, however, is not. Silence is open, undefined, expansive. It doesn't deliver a clear truth, only possibilities. And the brain, when faced with too many possibilities, goes into a state of alert. That's why a lack of information generates anxiety, tension, and expectation in such a powerful way. When you don't know what's happening, the brain tries to protect you by anticipating scenarios. It starts running internal simulations, searching for patterns in the past, pulling up memories that may no longer even make sense. Small details gain exaggerated weight. A delay becomes a signal. A pause becomes a message. A lack of response becomes judgment. None of this is conscious. It happens behind the scenes. The discomfort of not knowing isn't rational, but it manifests itself very concretely in the body. Breathing changes. Muscles become more tense. Attention narrows. It's as if the mind enters a mode of silent vigilance, waiting for something to happen, even when nothing happens. And the more time passes without information, the more space there is for the imagination to fill this void with increasingly intense narratives. This impacts decisions, relationships, and even how we interpret reality. Many choices are not made based on facts, but in an attempt to alleviate this feeling of uncertainty. Sometimes, a person prefers to hear something bad rather than continue waiting. They prefer to provoke a response, any response, just to end that internal state of suspense. Because the brain understands not knowing as a continuous threat, something that needs to be resolved. This dynamic reveals a hidden truth about how the mind works. We don't just seek physical security. We seek predictability. The brain wants clear maps of what's happening, even if those maps are uncomfortable. When there is no map at all, it creates one. And it creates it quickly. This is an old strategy shaped by survival, but one that now operates in completely different contexts. Messages, emails, social relationships, professional decisions, emotional expectations. The mental journey that begins in silence is rarely neutral. The brain doesn't usually fill in the gaps with positive scenarios. It tends to go straight to what seems most urgent, most threatening, most impactful. Not because you enjoy suffering, but because, throughout evolution, taking risks has been safer than ignoring them. Better to prepare for the worst than to be caught off guard. This logic still guides many automatic reactions, even when real danger doesn't exist. And the more a person experiences unresolved uncertainties, the more sensitive this mechanism becomes. Small silences begin to generate large internal reactions. The brain learns from emotional impact, not logic. If, at some point, the absence of information brought pain, rejection, or loss, it registers this as a pattern to be avoided. From then on, any similar situation triggers the same alert, even if the context is different. This process influences mindset, perception of personal value, and even how someone interprets the behavior of others. Many insecurities don't stem from concrete facts, but from poorly interpreted voids. Silence becomes a mirror, and in it, the person projects fears, doubts, and stories that seem real, but are merely internal constructs. Important revelations emerge when we realize that the suffering didn't come from reality itself, but from the way the brain tried to protect it. There is also a profound impact on personal transformation when this mechanism begins to be observed. Not controlled, not repressed, just perceived. When you understand that the discomfort of not knowing is an automatic reflex, something that happens before reason comes into play, a small space begins to emerge between the stimulus and the reaction. This space changes everything. It doesn't eliminate anxiety immediately, but it alters the relationship with it. Behind the scenes of the mind, the The brain continues trying to fill the void, but now there is awareness. And awareness changes the journey. It doesn't erase the alert, but it allows us to question the narrative being created. Does this silence really mean danger? Or is it just an absence of data being interpreted by a system too old for the current world? This type of question doesn't seek quick answers. It opens space for something deeper. As this understanding deepens, it becomes clear that many emotional tensions don't require external answers, but internal clarity. The brain will continue searching for meaning, but you begin to realize when it's merely trying to fill in the gaps with hypotheses. This recognition doesn't end the process, but it changes how it's experienced. And it's precisely at this point that the conversation begins to take on another layer, more subtle, more revealing. Because understanding the discomfort of not knowing is only the surface. What really matters is understanding how the brain constructs these interpretations, why it insists on treating them as absolute truths, and what happens when these internal narratives are observed more closely. Comment below, this makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because there's a silent principle that runs through everything we've been talking about so far. The brain hates emptiness. It wasn't made to coexist with blank spaces, with gaps, with a lack of meaning. Where information is lacking, it doesn't wait calmly. It acts. It fills it in. And it does so with impressive speed, long before any conscious reflection comes into play. For the brain, emptiness is never neutral. It's not interpreted as "I don't know yet," but as "something is missing and that could be dangerous." That's the central point. When information doesn't arrive, when an answer doesn't come, when an expected signal disappears, the brain enters automatic correction mode. It begins to construct meaning from fragments, memories, past emotions, and expectations. It's behind the scenes of this process that interpretations emerge that seem like absolute certainties, even without any concrete basis. And almost always, these interpretations follow the same direction. It's not the lightest scenario. It's not the most optimistic. It's the most threatening. The most uncomfortable. The one that generates the greatest emotional impact. The inevitable question arises, why always the worst? Why does the brain tend to fill the void with fear, rejection, loss, or failure, instead of neutral or positive possibilities? The answer is less tied to the present and more to how this system has been shaped over time. The brain learned that quickly filling a gap was an evolutionary advantage. Faced with the unknown, taking risks increased the chances of survival. If there was silence in the forest, it was safer to imagine a predator than to ignore the signal. This ancient logic hasn't disappeared. It has simply changed its setting. Today the predator isn't in the woods, but the brain continues to react as if it were. The problem is that this autocomplete happens without asking permission. It doesn't ask if you want to think about it now. It doesn't wait for complete context. It simply connects loose ends and presents a ready-made narrative, with a beginning, middle, and end. A fabricated truth. A hidden truth in the most literal sense. It seems real, it sounds convincing, but it was born from a void. This mechanism has a profound impact on how we deal with relationships, work, expectations, and important decisions. A delay becomes indifference. A lack of response becomes rejection. Silence becomes confirmation of something bad. The brain prefers a closed, negative story to an open space full of uncertainties. Emptiness bothers more than pain. And this says a lot about our mentality as a species. There's something almost disconcerting about realizing that many anxieties don't stem from what happened, but from what didn't happen, from what wasn't said, from what wasn't explained, from what was left open-ended. The brain looks at this blank space and feels an urgent need to fill it. And in doing so, it uses the material it has available. Past experiences, old fears, unresolved frustrations. It doesn't create stories from scratch. It recycles emotions. This process also reveals why two people can react in completely different ways to the same silence. For one, it goes unnoticed. For another, it becomes an internal earthquake. The brain doesn't fill voids universally. It fills them according to one's own emotional history. Each void is interpreted in light of the individual's journey. That's where the most important revelations come in. Understanding this mechanism is understanding oneself. When the brain encounters an information void, it feels the need to act quickly. Not because it's certain of the danger, but because not being able to bear the uncertainty seems more threatening than dealing with a concrete negative scenario. The unknown is too vast. It has no contours. It has no clear limits. The worst-case scenario, however painful, offers a sense of closure, a false sense of control. And this silently shapes decisions. Many actions are taken not to solve a real problem, but to alleviate the discomfort of not knowing. Sometimes the person confronts unnecessarily. Other times they withdraw. In some cases they anticipate too much. All of this stems from the attempt to fill an internal void. The brain wants to solve it even if the solution is only imaginary. This pattern also influences how we deal with the truth. Real truth is usually complex, nuanced, and layered. Truth created by the brain, on the other hand, is simple, direct, and emotionally charged. It doesn't require waiting. It doesn't require investigation. It simply presents itself as self-evident. And that's precisely why it seems so convincing. Behind the scenes, the brain isn't concerned with precision. It's concerned with impact, with reducing uncertainty, with restoring a sense of predictability. Even if it costs tranquility, even if it generates unnecessary anxiety. This is a price the system is willing to pay because, throughout history, this cost seemed less than ignoring a potential danger. Understanding this changes how we perceive our own thoughts. We realize that not all certainty comes from facts. Some come only from the urgency to fill an empty space. This recognition doesn't eliminate discomfort immediately, but it begins a silent transformation in the relationship with one's own mind. You start to observe the thought before believing it. You begin to perceive the exact moment when the brain tries to piece together parts that don't necessarily belong to the same puzzle. And the more visible this process becomes, the more questions arise. If the brain automatically fills in gaps, how can we distinguish between real perception and interpretation? How can we tell when an internal narrative is born from facts or just from gaps? What impact does this have on the choices we make every day, the relationships we build, and how we see ourselves? These questions don't demand immediate answers. They open up space. A space different from the one the brain tries to hastily close. A space for observation. And it is precisely there that the conversation begins to gain even greater depth, because understanding that the brain hates emptiness is only the beginning of something much more revealing. Write in the comments, "I'm on this journey too." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because to truly understand why the brain reacts so badly to a lack of information, we need to go back much further in time. Long before unanswered messages, unreturned emails, or meetings without an agenda. We need to go back to a period when the absence of signals wasn't just uncomfortable, it could be fatal. For most of human history, living meant constantly interpreting the environment. Sounds, movements, smells, shadows. Everything was information. Everything had the potential to impact survival. And in this context, silence was never neutral. On the contrary, silence was a signal in itself. In the forest, when the birds stopped singing, when the wind suddenly ceased, when nothing moved, that didn't mean peace. It meant maximum attention. Something was out of place. The brain was shaped by this scenario. It learned, generation after generation, that the absence of known signals could indicate the presence of something unknown and potentially dangerous. A predator made no noise before attacking. A real risk rarely announced itself clearly. So, waiting for confirmation could be too costly. The brain needed to become quick, anticipatory, almost paranoid. This was not a flaw in the system. It was an adaptive advantage. This is where one of the most powerful mechanisms of the human mind is born. In the face of silence, assume a threat until proven otherwise. Not because the danger is certain, but because ignoring it would be too risky. This logic has saved lives for thousands of years. It has shaped quick decisions, automatic reactions, and immediate interpretations. And even though the world has changed radically, the brain still operates with this basic programming running in the background. When you feel that tightness in your stomach due to a lack of response, when your mind starts creating negative scenarios without any concrete data, it's not emotional weakness. It's evolutionary inheritance. It's an ancient system trying to function in a modern environment. The brain doesn't easily distinguish between the silence of the forest and the digital silence. For it, absence remains absence. And absence has always been associated with risk. From a scientific point of view, this makes sense. The brain didn't evolve to seek psychological comfort. It evolved to maximize chances of survival. If, at some point, assuming the worst increased the probability of staying alive, this pattern was reinforced. Natural selection didn't reward those who calmly waited for more information. It favored those who acted sooner. This hidden truth about the human mind helps explain why the brain fills in gaps so quickly and why it almost never chooses the mildest scenario. It's not interested in emotional justice. It's interested in avoiding surprises. The worst-case scenario, however unpleasant, prepares the body and mind to react. It puts the system on alert. It reduces the surprise factor. And, for a brain shaped by survival, this seems like a good strategy. The impact of this mechanism goes far beyond immediate fear. It influences the mindset with which we interpret the world. The absence of information activates not only anxiety, but a defensive posture towards reality. The brain begins to see the environment as something that needs to be constantly monitored. Every silence becomes a potential signal. Every gap becomes a problem to be solved, even when there is no problem at all. This ancient programming also explains why clear explanations tend to be more relieving than vague answers. A direct no tends to be less disruptive than a we'll see. Difficult but definite news generates less stress than an indefinite wait. The brain prefers a known threat to an invisible risk. Predictability, even negative predictability, is less stressful than prolonged uncertainty. Behind the scenes of the mind, this logic continues to operate without us realizing it. It affects important decisions, personal relationships, and professional expectations. Many intense emotional reactions don't stem from the content of the situation, but from how the brain interprets the absence of clear signals. The mind enters survival mode when it feels it has lost its bearings. And in this mode, it doesn't seek balance. It seeks protection. Understanding this evolutionary origin doesn't eliminate the discomfort, but it changes the relationship with it. You begin to realize that this internal alarm isn't an enemy, but a reflection of a system that has worked very well for a long time. The problem isn't the mechanism itself, but the context in which it's being applied. A brain designed to survive in the wild now needs to deal with social silences, emotional ambiguities, and incomplete information all the time. This awareness opens the door to transformation. Not in the sense of switching off the brain, but of recognizing when it is reacting to ghosts of the past instead of real dangers of the present. The journey is not about eliminating the impulse, but about learning to observe it. Understanding that not every silence hides a predator. That not every absence of response is a threat. That often the brain is simply doing what it has learned to do. And the more this understanding deepens, the clearer it becomes that there is a specific moment when the mind crosses an invisible line. A point where anticipation ceases to be protection and becomes distortion. Where survival turns into unnecessary suffering. It is precisely at this point that the most important revelations begin about how the brain constructs meaning, creates narratives, and transforms absence into certainty. Comment below, this makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because up to this point we've talked about why the brain reacts badly to silence, and where does that come from. But now is the time to open the hood and look at the mechanism working in real time, in the simplest and most honest way possible. No heavy jargon. No artificial mystery. Just understanding what happens inside the mind when information disappears. It all begins with something seemingly harmless. A lack of data. Nothing actually happened. No message arrived, no response was given, no signal appeared. From an objective point of view, this is simply absence. But the brain doesn't see it that way. For it, a lack of data is not a neutral state, it's an open problem. An incomplete puzzle. And the brain hates unsolved puzzles. The moment this gap is perceived, the second element of the process emerges. Increased uncertainty. And here lies a crucial point. The brain doesn't react to the danger itself, but to the uncertainty about the danger. It functions much better when it knows exactly what it's dealing with, even if it's something bad. When it doesn't know, the system goes into tension. It's as if the mind is saying, something important is missing and I can't ignore it. This uncertainty doesn't remain confined to the realm of ideas. It spreads throughout the body. Attention narrows, focus shifts, and thoughts begin to circle. The mind searches for patterns, references, anything that helps fill that void. And the longer the wait goes unanswered, the more urgent this search becomes. The uncertainty grows like an internal pressure demanding resolution. This is where the third stage comes into play, the activation of the alert system. The brain understands that if something unknown exists, it's best to prepare. Even without proof. Even without clear signs. The system responsible for detecting threats is activated, not because the danger is real but because he can't be. And for the brain, it could be is reason enough. This state of heightened alert completely changes how the mind interprets every detail. Thoughts become faster but less discerning. Emotions take priority over logic. The brain isn't trying to be fair or balanced, it's trying to protect itself. It's a mode of operation that prioritizes speed over accuracy. Solving quickly matters more than solving well. And then we arrive at the fourth stage, perhaps the most fascinating and the most treacherous, the automatic creation of negative hypotheses. Faced with emptiness, the brain doesn't wait for reality to reveal itself. It creates a version of it. And this version is almost never neutral. It tends towards the worst plausible scenario. Not because it's the most likely, but because it's the safest from an evolutionary point of view. Something subtle yet powerful happens here. The hypothesis created by the brain doesn't present itself as an assumption. It arises with a feeling of truth. It seems logical. It seems obvious. It even seems inevitable. The brain connects old emotions, past experiences, and known fears, and delivers a ready-made narrative. An explanation that fills the void, even if it's false. It is at this moment that many people confuse thought with reality. The mind creates a story to fill the gap, and this story begins to guide emotions, decisions, and behaviors. The body reacts as if it were fact. The heart races, anxiety increases, posture changes. All this without any new information having emerged. This entire process happens in seconds. Sometimes in fractions of a second. And most importantly, it happens before conscious reflection. By the time you realize you're already distressed, irritated, or apprehensive, your brain has already gone through all these stages. Lack of data, uncertainty, alert, negative hypothesis. The script has already been written behind the scenes. This is one of the most important hidden truths about how the human mind works. We react not only to what happens but to what the brain. You're welcome. This can happen when you don't know enough. Much of the emotional impact of daily life stems precisely from this. Not from the facts but from the gaps between them. This is what we explore here on Dark Human Science. Not the event itself, but the invisible mechanisms that transform absence into threat, silence into meaning, emptiness into narrative. Understanding this process is like turning on the light in a dark room. The objects have always been there, but now you can see them more clearly. And this clarity begins to provoke small internal transformations. You start to perceive when a feeling arose from a real fact and when it was born only from its absence. You begin to notice the exact moment when the mind tries to close a story too quickly. This doesn't prevent the brain from creating hypotheses, but it changes the way you relate to them. The journey here isn't about eliminating the mechanism. That would be impossible. It's about gaining awareness of it. Understanding that the warning system isn't always reacting to a present danger, but to an absence that it doesn't know how to tolerate. And when this perception sets in, something interesting happens. A small space emerges between the stimulus and the reaction. This space is subtle yet powerful. It's where decisions begin to change. Where mindsets adjust. Where a person realizes that not every perceived threat warrants an immediate response. That some internal narratives are merely the brain's attempts to reduce uncertainty, not faithful reflections of reality. The more you observe this process, the more evident it becomes how much it influences relationships, choices, and even how you see yourself. Many insecurities don't stem from real rejections, but from hypotheses created to fill voids. Many tensions don't come from concrete conflicts, but from silences interpreted as signals. Such revelations don't provide ready-made answers, but they change your perspective. And when that perspective shifts, a new, even deeper question naturally arises. If the brain creates these automatic hypotheses to protect itself, what happens when we begin to question these narratives the moment they are born? Write in the comments, "This makes sense to me." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there's a silent misconception that many people carry without realizing it. The idea that imagining the worst is a sign of pessimism, emotional weakness, or negative thinking. It isn't. At least not in the brain's logic. When the mind races straight to the most threatening scenario, it's not trying to sabotage you. It's trying to conserve energy and increase your chances of survival. The problem is that this strategy, which made perfect sense in the past, now has a very different impact. The brain has always operated with limited resources: time, attention, energy. It needed to learn to decide quickly with little information because waiting too long could cost a life. Faced with a strange noise, an out-of-place shadow, or an unexpected silence, there were two options: ignore it or take a risk. Ignoring it was cheap emotionally but too expensive if the danger was real. Taking a risk cost anxiety, tension, discomfort, but increased the chances of staying alive. The brain did the math and chose the second path. Imagining the worst wasn't pessimism. It was efficiency. It was a quick way to prepare the body to act. The negative scenario activated muscles, accelerated the heart, sharpened the senses. Everything was ready to react. If the danger didn't materialize, the cost was just a scare. But if it was real, the anticipated reaction could make all the difference. This logic has shaped the brain over thousands of years. This is the hidden truth behind catastrophic thinking. It doesn't arise because the brain enjoys suffering, but because it prefers to err on the side of excessive caution. From an evolutionary perspective, it was safer to live with a few false alarms than with fatal silence. The mind learned that it's better to be unnecessarily frightened than to reassure oneself too soon. The problem begins when this same mechanism is applied to situations that don't involve real physical risk. The brain doesn't clearly distinguish between a hidden predator and an unanswered email. To it, both are dangerous gaps. Both activate the same system. The difference is that, in the modern world, this alert rarely leads to physical action. It keeps spinning internally, creating prolonged emotional wear and tear. Energy conservation here doesn't mean spending less on emotions, but on less processing power. Imagining the worst quickly closes the story. It eliminates possibilities. It reduces complexity. Instead of dealing with dozens of possible scenarios, the brain chooses one, usually the most threatening. This gives a false sense of control. The mind thinks, okay, I already know what I'm dealing with. Even if it doesn't. This rapid closure directly impacts mindset. When the brain chooses the worst-case scenario, it creates internal coherence. Everything starts to make sense within that narrative. Emotions align, thoughts reinforce each other, and decisions begin to follow the same logic. The person doesn't realize they are reacting to a hypothesis. They feel as if they are reacting to reality. This strategy also explains why many people say, "I knew it," after something bad happens, even when there wasn't enough information beforehand. The brain likes to confirm its own negative predictions. This reinforces the idea that imagining the worst works. That being always emotionally prepared avoids surprises. The cost of this is living in a constant state of alert. There is a profound irony here. The brain tries to protect itself, but ends up generating unnecessary suffering. It saves cognitive energy in the short term, but creates emotional wear and tear in the long term. The mind gets used to operating under tension. The body adapts to the alert. Anxiety ceases to be the exception and becomes the backdrop. This pattern influences important decisions. People avoid conversations, opportunities, or changes not because they know something will go wrong, but because their brains have already filled the void with a compelling negative scenario. The decision doesn't stem from facts, but from anticipations. The person's journey becomes guided by internal narratives that have never been tested in reality. It's important to realize that the brain doesn't do this maliciously. It has no intention. It follows patterns. It replicates old strategies in new contexts. When you understand this, something begins to change in how you relate to your own thoughts. Instead of fighting them or blindly believing them, you begin to observe them. This reframing is a form of silent transformation. It doesn't eliminate fear, but it changes its interpretation. You begin to realize that that automatic negative image is just a protective attempt, not a reliable prediction. That the brain doesn't want to scare you. It wants to reduce uncertainty. It wants to prepare the ground. It wants to avoid surprises. This awareness opens up space for more conscious choices. When a catastrophic thought arises, instead of engaging with it, you can acknowledge, "This is my brain trying to conserve energy." This simple phrase changes the emotional impact. It creates distance. It creates perspective. It doesn't prevent the thought from arising, but it prevents it from becoming absolute truth. Behind the scenes, the brain continues to operate in the same way. But the way you respond begins to change. And that alters the internal journey. The person begins to tolerate the emptiness a little more. The uncertainty a little more. Not because they've stopped feeling discomfort, but because they understand where it comes from. And when this understanding deepens, an even more interesting question arises. If imagining the worst was an effective survival strategy, what happens when the brain realizes that the context has changed? When it begins to learn that not all silence is a threat, that not every gap needs to be closed immediately? This question doesn't require an answer right now. It simply opens the door to the next layer of this conversation, where we begin to see how this mechanism, which once saved lives, now shapes behaviors, relationships, and choices in ways we almost never realize. Comment below, "This makes sense to me." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, bringing it into the territory where everything becomes impossible to ignore: everyday life. Because up to this point we've talked about mechanisms, the brain, survival, invisible processes. But the truth is that this functioning manifests itself all the time, in the most common, banal, and shareable situations possible. And that's precisely why it has such an impact. Imagine the simplest scenario of all. You send a message on WhatsApp. Nothing special. A hi, a short question, something routine. The person sees it. Time passes. 5 minutes. 10. Half an hour. The brain starts to work. Not because something happened, but because it happened. The absence of a response becomes an empty space that the mind feels compelled to fill. Did I say something wrong? Did the person get angry? Did I do something without realizing it? In a few moments, a neutral interaction becomes an emotional minefield. The curious thing is that, rationally, you know there are dozens of possible explanations. The person might be busy, driving, working, distracted. But the brain doesn't work with balanced lists when faced with a void. It chooses a narrative and sticks with it. And it almost always chooses the one that generates the most emotional impact. Not because it's the truest, but because it fills the gap faster. Now the scene changes. A medical exam. You've already had the procedure, you've already gotten through the tense moment, you've already left. All that's missing is the result. Days go by. No calls. No updates. The body begins to react even before the mind can formulate complete sentences. A tightness in the chest. An unease difficult to explain. The brain begins to fill the silence with hypotheses you never wanted to imagine. Even without any new information, the anxiety grows. Here once again, it's not the bad news that hurts, it's the indefinite wait. Notice how the pattern repeats itself? The brain doesn't go on alert when it receives clear bad information. It goes on alert when it receives no information at all. The absence creates a state of psychological suspension. And this state is difficult to sustain. The brain wants to get out of it as soon as possible, even if it needs to create a negative scenario to do so. Now think about something corporate. A meeting scheduled on the calendar. No agenda. No context. Just a blocked time slot. Automatically, the mind starts working. Did I do something wrong? Is there going to be a reprimand? Is it something serious? The brain doesn't like meetings without a clear meaning. It interprets the lack of context as risk. Not because the meeting is bad, but because the lack of information activates the same old alert system. The same thing happens when the boss says something like, "We'll talk later." Not now. No explanation. Just throwing the phrase out there. The whole day changes. Productivity drops. Attention becomes fragmented. The brain tries to guess what's behind those words. And once again, it doesn't usually imagine compliments. It imagines problems. The phrase doesn't contain an explicit threat, but the lack of detail is enough to trigger the alarm. These examples are so common that almost no one questions the process behind them. We just feel, react, suffer. But when you start to look more closely, you realize that the pattern is always the same. Lack of information. Increased uncertainty. Alert system activated. Negative narrative created. All this happens without conscious effort, as part of the automatic functioning of the mind. The impact of this on daily life is enormous. Relationships are strained by interpretations that have never been confirmed. Decisions are postponed or rushed to alleviate the discomfort of waiting. Emotions are felt as if they were responses to facts, when in reality they are responses to gaps. This is one of the most difficult hidden truths to accept. Much emotional pain does not come from reality, but from the way the brain tries to anticipate it. There is also a cumulative effect. The more situations of this type someone experiences, the more sensitive the brain becomes to any sign of absence. Small silences begin to generate large reactions. The mindset adjusts to always expect the worst. Not because the person is negative, but because the brain has learned that filling a void quickly is more comfortable than enduring it. This silently shapes the emotional journey. The person begins to live anticipating conflicts, rejections, losses. They live more in an imagined future than in the real present. And the most curious thing is that, when reality finally arrives, it is often much simpler than the story created. But the emotional toll has already been taken. These everyday examples are powerful because everyone recognizes themselves in them. They show that the brain isn't broken. It's functioning exactly as it was designed to function. The problem is that the environment has changed faster than the internal mechanisms. Today we live with delays, silences, and ambiguities all the time. And the brain interprets each of them as a small survival test. When this perception begins to form, something changes in your perspective. You start to notice the exact moment when a story begins to be created within your mind. You perceive when the body reacts before the event even exists. This doesn't prevent the reaction, but it brings awareness. And awareness alters the impact. It creates space. It creates choice. And it is precisely in this space that the next inevitable question arises. If these examples are so common and the mechanism behind them is so automatic, what happens when we learn to interrupt this sequence midway? When we notice the warning sign appearing before the narrative solidifies? This is the bridge that takes us even deeper into this conversation, where the focus shifts from just the brain reacting, to how we can relate to these reactions at the exact moment they arise. Write in the comments, "I'm on this journey too." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because there's a delicate, almost invisible, point where a mechanism that was created to protect begins to do the exact opposite. Up to this point, everything we've described makes sense from the brain's point of view. Anticipating risks, filling in gaps, imagining difficult scenarios. The problem arises when this system ceases to be a one-off resource and becomes the default mode of operation for the mind. When this happens, the alert ceases to be the exception and becomes routine. The brain no longer enters a state of vigilance only in response to specific silences, but to practically any ambiguous situation. Small gaps begin to be interpreted as major threats. The body lives in constant readiness. And the cost of this begins to appear silently but profoundly. Chronic anxiety is one of the first signs. Not the punctual anxiety linked to a real event, but a continuous state of anticipation. The feeling that something could go wrong at any moment. The brain begins to expend energy trying to predict scenarios that may never happen. The mind doesn't rest because there's always some gap to be filled, some detail still unexplained, some answer that hasn't arrived. The future becomes hostile territory even before it exists. This anxiety doesn't arise because the person is weak or overly sensitive. It arises because the brain is operating at an alert level incompatible with the current reality. A system designed to react to immediate physical threats now reacts to social silences, emotional ambiguities, and incomplete information all the time. The impact of this on the emotional journey is enormous. Over time, this constant anticipation begins to affect how the person sees others. Social paranoia emerges, not in the extreme clinical sense, but in a daily and debilitating version. Gazes are interpreted. Tones of voice are analyzed. Pauses become hidden messages. The person begins to look for signs of rejection or conflict even when there is no concrete evidence. The brain, trained to fill voids with danger, begins to see threat in everything that is not explicitly positive. This state creates a distorted lens. Reality continues to unfold, but it is perceived through a filter of suspicion. Relationships become more strained. Simple conversations gain layers that were never there before. The mind begins to work against its own experience, creating internal conflicts that don't need to exist. Another profound effect of this mechanism in excess is the distortion of the interpretation of reality. The brain ceases to differentiate between hypothesis and fact. Automatic thoughts begin to be treated as truths. The internal narrative gains more weight than external data. Even when contrary information arises, it is discarded or reinterpreted to fit the already created story. This happens because the brain hates reopening gaps. Once it closes a narrative, even a negative one, it clings to it. Letting go of that story would mean returning to the initial void, to uncertainty, to discomfort. So, paradoxically, the brain prefers to maintain a painful interpretation rather than admit that perhaps it filled in the gap incorrectly. This is one of the darkest aspects of the process. The mechanism that should protect begins to imprison. The mind enters a cycle where fear generates negative interpretation. Negative interpretation generates more alertness, and alertness reinforces fear. All this without the person clearly perceiving the point of origin. It seems that anxiety simply is like that. But behind the scenes there is a system working non-stop. Decisions are also affected. Many choices become guided by attempts to avoid discomfort, not by the search for meaning or growth. People stop taking a stand, trying, asking, and waiting. They prefer to act too soon, give up too soon, or shut down. Not because they know something will go wrong, but because the brain has already decided that enduring emptiness is unbearable. This dynamic profoundly alters one's mindset. The person begins to live in defensive mode. The journey ceases to be exploratory and becomes preventative. Instead of asking what could happen, the mind asks, how do I prevent something bad from happening? The world begins to be interpreted as a field of risks to be managed, not as a space of experiences to be lived. The emotional impact of this is cumulative. The body feels it. The mind gets tired. The constant feeling of being on guard generates exhaustion, irritability, and difficulty concentrating. The person doesn't understand exactly why, but feels like they're always one step behind, always preparing for something that never arrives. And when it does arrive, it's often much smaller than the imagined scenario. There's an important revelation here. The problem isn't the mechanism itself, but the lack of awareness about when it's operating out of context. The brain doesn't warn you when it's gone too far. It just keeps doing what it's learned to do. It's up to consciousness to realize when protection has become imprisonment. This recognition doesn't bring immediate relief, but it changes the relationship with one's own thoughts. Instead of automatically identifying with every negative narrative, the possibility of observation arises. Is this a fact or is it a gap being filled? This simple question begins to break the cycle. It doesn't eliminate the warning, but it creates space between the feeling and the reaction. And it is in this space that something new begins to form. A silent transformation. The possibility of tolerating the emptiness a little longer. The uncertainty a little longer. Not because it has ceased to be uncomfortable, but because now there is understanding. There is context. There is choice. When the brain begins to realize that not all silence is a threat, that not all absence needs to be interpreted immediately, the alert system gradually begins to recalibrate. Not by force but through experience. This adjustment doesn't happen all at once. It happens in small moments of perception, when the person notices the impulse to fill the gap, and decides to wait a little longer. This conscious waiting is uncomfortable but revealing. It shows how much the brain wants to rush to close stories. And that's exactly where the conversation gains its next layer, because understanding when this mechanism starts to get in the way opens the door to something even deeper. What happens when we learn to interrupt this cycle before it becomes entrenched? Write this down. This makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because after everything we've covered so far, something is starting to become clear in an almost uncomfortable way. The threat that the brain tries so hard to avoid isn't always external. Often it's born within. It arises at the exact moment when the mind confronts emptiness and decides it can't leave it open. Throughout this journey, we've seen how the brain reacts to absence, how it hates gaps, how it activates ancient alert systems, and how it fills silences with hypotheses that seem like truths. We've also seen how this affects emotions, decisions, relationships, and even how someone perceives their own reality. But there's an important turning point here, and it's not a comfortable one because it shifts the focus from the world to the inside. The real danger isn't always in what you don't know. Often it's in what your brain invents when it doesn't know. This phrase seems simple, but it carries a profound impact. Because if this is true, and everything indicates that it is, then much of everyday suffering comes not from facts but from stories. Stories hastily created to fill voids. Stories that emerge in the background of the mind and take emotional control before any verification takes place. The brain doesn't wait for reality to manifest itself. It anticipates it. It constructs it. It protects it in the way it has learned. And the price of this is often living by reacting to something that never existed outside of one's own mind. This is one of the most difficult hidden truths to accept, because it messes with the feeling of control. If fear doesn't come from the world but from interpretation, then transformation lies not in eliminating external risks, but in changing the relationship with internal processes. This doesn't mean ignoring real signs, nor romanticizing uncertainty. It means recognizing that there's a huge difference between concrete danger and imagined danger. And the brain, by default, doesn't clearly distinguish between these two things. It treats both with the same urgency. The impact of this is living in a constant state of anticipation, as if something is always about to happen. When this awareness begins to take hold, the way you look at your own thoughts changes. That automatic certainty loses some of its power. It doesn't disappear, but it ceases to be absolute. A silent question arises: is this a fact or a story my brain created to fill a void? That question in itself changes everything, because it interrupts the automatic flow. It creates a minimal space between stimulus and reaction, a space where consciousness enters the scene. And this space, however small, alters decisions. It alters emotional responses. It alters mindset. Not abruptly but progressively, almost imperceptibly. This process is not comfortable. Sustaining not knowing has never been easy for the human brain. It will resist. It will try to close stories again. It will insist on offering ready-made scenarios. And that's part of it. The transformation is not in silencing the mind, but in learning to listen more critically. In perceiving when a thought arises from real data and when it arises only from the need to reduce uncertainty. There's something liberating about realizing you don't have to believe everything your brain produces. Thoughts are mental events, not definitive sentences. Emotions are responses, not proofs. When this distinction becomes clear, the relationship with fear changes. It ceases to be an invisible enemy and becomes a signal to be observed. This shift in perspective has a silent but profound impact. Relationships gain more space. Decisions become less reactive. The present begins to carry more weight than imagined futures. The inner journey ceases to be a constant race to fill gaps and gradually becomes a more conscious coexistence with them. The most interesting thing is that none of this requires rigid control or excessive effort. It requires perception. It requires presence. It requires the willingness to perceive the exact moment when the mind begins to invent, so as not to wait. This moment is subtle, but it exists. And when you learn to recognize it, something begins to reorganize itself from within. This is not a quick fix, nor a promise of permanent tranquility. It's an invitation to observe. An invitation to see behind the scenes of your own mental functioning. Because when you understand that the brain doesn't want to scare you, but to protect you, the relationship changes. You stop fighting against it and start dialoguing with it. And it is precisely in this dialogue that the most important revelations emerge. Not about the world outside, but about how you construct meaning, react to silence, and interpret absence. Reality remains full of uncertainties. Silences continue to exist. Gaps continue to appear. The difference lies in how they are experienced. When the brain realizes that not every void needs to be filled immediately, something begins to adjust. Not through imposition but through experience. The mind learns little by little that waiting isn't always dangerous. That the unknown doesn't always hide a threat. That some internal stories can simply be let go. And it is precisely at this point that the conversation deepens even further, because recognizing the mechanism is only the beginning. From here, the question ceases to be, why does my brain do this? And becomes, what happens when I perceive this happening in real time? That's when the journey gains another layer. Comment below, this makes sense to me. If you've made it this far, perhaps something inside you recognized this story. Maybe not as theory but as experience. Like that moment when silence weighed more than any words, or when your mind raced faster than reality. If this conversation stayed with you until the end, it's worth recording that. Write something simple in the comments just so I know you were really here. It could be, I'm with you until the end, or, this message was for me. Sometimes, naming what touched us is already part of the process. And if, at any point in the video you felt that silent connection, as if someone were putting into words something you'd already felt but never organized, leave a like. Not as an automatic gesture but as a sign that this exchange made sense. That's what keeps this type of content alive, relevant, and going deeper with each video. Subscribing to the channel is a simple way to continue this journey. Here, the idea has never been to provide ready-made answers, but to open up spaces. To explore the inner workings of the mind, to question easy certainties, and to look more carefully at what normally goes unnoticed. If this type of reflection helps you see the world, and yourself, more clearly, then it makes sense to continue here. And before you leave, there's a video here that perfectly complements this conversation. It delves into another layer of this same mechanism from a different angle. Click there and continue watching. Ultimately, perhaps the greatest danger was never silence itself, but to believe without questioning the first story that the mind told to fill it. This is dark human science, where perception is not reality.